Hey, 42 here. Let's imagine for a moment we're walking together down the streets of a British town in the early part of the 19th century. It's almost dawn and the gas street lamps form yellow globes of light in the early morning mist. Ahead, we see a figure begin to emerge from the haze. It appears to be human, but from its body extends a long, thin appendage that reaches high into the gloom. Is it an alien? Is that an antenna in its pocket? Or is it just pleased to see us? No, it's a man, and as he moves closer we see he's carrying a long bamboo cane that he uses to tap on the upper floor window of each house that he passes. He's a knocker-up, also known as a knocker-upper, someone hired to wake people in the morning to ensure they get to work on time. Not to be confused with the other type of knocker-upper who does his job once and gets paid 9 months later. Starting in the industrial era, in the times before reliable and cost-effective alarm clocks, knocker-ups were the people who got you out of bed in the morning. Charles Dickens made reference to knocking up in his novel Great Expectations, which makes sense because life in Victorian England was pretty shit for most people. It's no surprise they needed a little extra motivation to get the day started. Times have changed, but most of us still find it hard to get going in the morning. If you really struggle to get out of bed each day, you may even have a condition called dysania, which, although not yet medically recognized, is a near complete inability to get out of bed in the morning that's thought to be linked to other conditions like depression and chronic fatigue syndrome. And if you have an overwhelming desire to stay in bed all day, you might have a closely related condition called clinomania, or you might just be horribly hungover. Regardless, waking up overly tired is usually a sign that something's wrong or you're not getting enough proper sleep, which could simply be due to your lifestyle or perhaps one of approximately 80 different sleep disorders. For example, if someone wakes you up whilst you're in deep sleep, you'll probably feel a bit lost and disorientated. If this response is particularly intense or occurs regularly, you may be experiencing confusional arousals, not to be mixed up with inappropriate arousal, which is a terrible affliction experienced by teenage boys at least 3 times a day. Confusional arousal is a condition in which you act in a very strange or confused way when you wake up. Episodes may involve inappropriate behavior, shouting, or an apparent inability to wake up. Sounds like me on any normal day. But you can be sure to get a good night's sleep when your balls are shaven and nicely scented with Manscaped, who have kindly sponsored this video. They sent over the all-in-one performance package kit. Let's take a look, shall we? I have to say I'm pretty excited to try out this new Lawnmower 3.0. It's waterproof, so you can maintain your lawn in the shower, and it's got advanced skin-safe technology to help reduce any nasty nicks and cuts. Manscaped have even created what we've all been longing for, a deodorant for your balls. It's called Crop Preserver. This beauty is my favourite. It's the Weed Whacker nose and ear hair trimmer. This will come in very handy since I haven't trimmed my nose hair since the 18th century. For a limited time, you can get all of this plus 2 free gifts. The Shed travel bag, which is super handy, and the lovely Manscaped anti-chafing boxer briefs. Go to manscaped.com today and get 20% off plus free international shipping plus 2 free gifts when you use promo code 42 at manscaped.com. Your balls and body will thank you. Other sleep disorders are even more bizarre. Have you ever suffered from exploding head syndrome? Although it sounds like a scene from a Quentin Tarantino film, it actually isn't quite as dramatic as you might think. Sufferers of this condition hear a sudden and incredibly loud noise like a gunshot or a door slamming just as they're drifting off to sleep, or as they wake up from a deep sleep, even though the room is completely silent. Every night, you move through several sleep cycles, with each cycle having 5 stages. 4 stages of non-rapid eye movement or non-REM sleep, and 1 stage of REM sleep. It is during REM sleep that you experience dreams, And to stop you acting out those fantasies in the real world and eating your alarm clock, mistaking it for your dream cheeseburger, your brain temporarily paralyzes your body, a process called atonia. Sleep paralysis happens when you gain consciousness before your body has moved fully out of the rapid eye movement or REM stage of sleep. And if you've ever experienced it, you'll know it can be absolutely terrifying. In this state, you're semi-awake or even fully awake, but completely unable to move a muscle. And as if total immobility weren't enough, there's even stranger symptoms of this surprisingly common condition. As many as 40% of people experience sleep paralysis at some point in their lives, and many recall sensing a presence nearby or even on top of them during the period of paralysis, causing a feeling of intense pressure on their chest and an inability to breathe. That presence has taken many forms, usually shaped by the cultural beliefs of the time. Characters have ranged from witches to trolls to ghosts to Harvey Weinstein, but aliens are the most popular nighttime chest sitters in the modern era. The condition is believed to be the origin of the incubus or succubus myths, which warn of demons that attack during the night, usually sexually. Sleep paralysis is also thought to have been the inspiration for the famous 18th century painting by Henry Fuseli, no relation to the pastor by the way, called The Nightmare, which shows a goblin sitting on the stomach of a sleeping woman. Confusional arousals, exploding head syndrome, and sleep paralysis are all examples of parasomnias, a broad group of sleep disorders that involve weird things happening whilst you're falling asleep, sleeping, or waking up. They can include strange dreams, emotions, movements, or behaviours, and most of them happen during non-REM sleep. They can sometimes be traumatic for the person involved or the people they live with, but for the most part, these conditions are fairly harmless. Take sleep talking, for instance. Sure, you may say a few embarrassing things out loud whilst asleep on the train, but seriously, if you like rubbing peanut butter on your nipples, you shouldn't be embarrassed to tell the world about it whilst unconscious. Or how about sleep sex, also known as sexsomnia? Nothing wrong with wanting to get your jollies off mid-slumber, is there? Then there's sleepwalking. Everyone knows someone with a funny sleepwalking story. But surely, apart from the risk of walking into things, pissing in your cupboard, or falling downstairs, it's all just a bit of fun, isn't it? Well, yes. Most manifestations of parasomnias have little impact in the wider world, but in some alarming cases, they have ended in violent, even fatal criminal acts being committed under the supposed blanket of sleep. The defendants in these cases have sworn they were asleep when committing their crimes and knew nothing of their actions, an argument that has come to be known as the sleepwalking defense. Sleepwalking, technically known as somnambulism, usually occurs during slow wave sleep, the deepest stages of non-REM sleep. Exactly what causes it isn't known, but essentially, the brain seems to get stuck between sleep and wakefulness. Recently, some researchers have provided an alternative theory that instead of being awake or asleep, sleepwalkers are both at the same time in what might be a new type of state dissociation, with consciousness and unconsciousness switching rapidly and continuously. Either way, sleepwalkers can do a lot more than walk. They may sit up and look around, pick up objects around the home, take a stroll out of the house, or even drive. There's a common myth that you shouldn't wake a sleepwalker, when, in fact, leaving someone to sleepwalk can lead to disastrous, even homicidal consequences, as we're about to find out. The first legal record of sleepwalking being used as a successful defense was in the United States in 1846, in what became known as the Boston Tragedy. Albert Terrell slit the throat of the woman he'd left his wife for, a prostitute named Maria Bickford, almost decapitating her in the process. Then, just to prove he meant business, he set fire to the brothel and fled to New Orleans, where he was arrested. In court, his lawyer argued that Terrell was a long-time and chronic sleepwalker and perhaps committed the crime whilst asleep. And the jury obviously thought it was a plausible story because Terrell was acquitted. In 1887, esteemed Paris detective Robert Ledru was sent to Normandy to help solve an ongoing case. He arrived at night and went to bed early, but woke the next morning to find his shoes and socks were soaked through. He also discovered the case he'd been assigned to was no longer a priority because, during the night, there had been a murder. A murder? Aye, a murder. A prominent businessman had been shot on the beach, with no clues as to why. Ledru investigated, taking plaster casts of the footprints that led to the corpse. He was, naturally, more than a little surprised to discover the footprints exactly matched his own. And combined with his inexplicably wet socks and shoes, he came to the startling conclusion: he was the murderer, despite having no recollection whatsoever of the crime. His findings were confirmed by ballistics testing, and he was imprisoned for his own good. During his incarceration, prison guards gave him a gun loaded with blanks. And one night, Ledru suddenly got up and started firing at the men guarding his cell. It was enough to convince the authorities that he was a homicidal sleepwalker and not a cold-blooded killer. Ledru was moved to a secluded farm outside of Paris and kept there until his death 50 years later. Perhaps the most well-known of these cases occurred in 1987 when Kenneth Parks, a young Canadian man, was acquitted of murder on the grounds of sleepwalking. One night, Parks climbed into his car and drove 14 miles to his parents-in-law's house, where he proceeded to strangle, beat, and stab his mother and father-in-law, with whom he apparently had close relationships. His mother-in-law was killed and his father-in-law seriously injured. Afterwards, still dripping with blood, Parks drove to a police station and confessed to the crimes. But witnesses said he appeared confused about what had happened. He had also severed tendons in both his hands during the attack and should have been feeling intense pain, but he seemed altogether unaware of his injuries. At the trial, the jury was convinced Parks had indeed been unconscious at the time, and he was found not guilty. More recently, in 2008, British man Brian Thomas was accused of the murder of his wife, who he admitted he'd strangled in the back of their camper van. Thomas couldn't remember what had happened, but thought he had been dreaming that his wife was an intruder. The prosecution eventually withdrew the charges, and the judge said that Thomas wasn't responsible for his actions. But before you start planning to bump off that annoying guy at work who always steals your parking space before giving an exaggerated yawn and claiming you were asleep the whole time, it's worth bearing in mind not everyone gets away with the sleepwalking defense. In 1997, in Phoenix, Arizona, Scott Fallater stabbed his wife 44 times with a hunting knife. His neighbor also testified to seeing him drag his wife's body to the pool before holding her head underwater. Fallater claimed to have been asleep at the time, saying he had a history of sleepwalking and had been sleep deprived in the run-up to the incident. The prosecution argued Fallater had tried to hide evidence of the murder in a way that was too complex to have been achieved whilst asleep. And in between the stabbing and the drowning, a neighbor also saw Fallater motion to his dog to lie down, which was considered a possible sign of consciousness. A jury found him guilty of first-degree murder in 1999. In Spain in 2001, Antonio Nieto brutally killed his wife and mother-in-law. His daughter and son tried to stop him, and both received severe injuries for their efforts. Nieto told the court he had been asleep during the attack and had been dreaming he was defending himself against aggressive ostriches. Full marks for inventiveness there, Antonio. But his children said he had recognized them during the attack and had even told them not to turn the light on because their mother, who had already been brutally assaulted, was supposedly sleeping. Nieto was sentenced to 10 years in a psychiatric facility. These are only a few of more than 100 examples of apparent sleep-related violence that have been reported in the last century or so, which include instances of homicide, assault, and sexual assault. For a long time, doctors and lawyers lumped all types of bizarre sleep violence under the heading of sleepwalking. But there was a distinct difference between somnambulism and another type of parasomnia, REM behavior disorder, or RBD. REM behavior disorder happens during REM sleep while someone is dreaming. But instead of the muscles being paralyzed as usual, the dreamer's body is still active and they're able to act out their dreams. When they're woken up, they can usually remember fragments of the dream they were in. This is different from sleepwalkers who, operating from non-REM sleep, usually have no recollection of what happened once they're woken, and are in general more confused and disorientated. Somnambulism and RBD are quite different, but I for one wouldn't be overly interested in the semantics if someone in a nightgown was chasing me with an axe. So why do these distinctions matter? In the end, they help to determine the tricky business of truth. Up until fairly recently, it was impossible to test whether someone was telling the truth when they claimed to have been asleep during a violent episode. Traditionally, courts have relied on historical and circumstantial evidence to make the call. Sleepwalking, for example, is partly genetic, and sufferers of RBD, or somnambulism, often have a history of the condition. Sleep deprivation, stress, alcohol, and drugs can also make someone more susceptible to an episode. Sleepwalking is also often triggered by a sound, heavy snoring being the most common. All of these points have in the past been used as indicators as to whether a defendant is telling the truth. But technological advancements have made it possible for scientists to make accurate assessments about whether someone is a genuine sleepwalker or just a sleep liar. Free lab tests are used to assess when someone is in different stages of sleep. The first, an electroencephalogram, EEG, records brain activity in the form of waves. The second, an electrooculogram, EOG, detects eye movements. And finally, an electromyogram, EMG, measures muscle activity via a sensor placed on the chin or an arm or a leg. Of course, the number of people who've committed a crime whilst asleep and wearing these sensors is pretty low. Okay, 0. So we don't have definitive proof of whether a potential murderer was asleep or not when they acted violently. But being able to retrospectively assess people's sleep patterns can help to establish probability. Because, if someone goes to sleep every night repeatedly slapping his penis as he drifts off, he's probably more partial to a spot of sleep murder than someone who sleeps like a log. Neuroimaging studies have also started to advance our understanding of how sleepwalking works. Claudio Bassetti of the University of Zurich has examined the brains of sleepwalkers using single photon emission computerized tomography, or SPECT. He has discovered that in sleepwalking states, your brain's cerebrum and cerebral cortex, the clever parts of your brain that decide the difference between right and wrong, shuts down. Your brain becomes directed by more primitive and automatic functions, the kind connected to hunger, sex, and survival. From a legal point of view, it confirms that sleepwalkers and sufferers of RBD are not conscious when they're asleep, and so cannot be considered to have mens rea, which is the intention to commit a crime, and is typically required for someone to be found guilty. We're still some way off from having a foolproof way of deciding whether or not someone was genuinely asleep when they committed some terrible act of violence. But we do now know that it is a real thing. So until we understand more, it might be an idea to hide the kitchen knives before you switch the lights off each night. And of course, sleep well. Thanks again to Manscaped for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to check them out, the link's in the description below.